Hello, 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 everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for another Coffee and CEU event from the DBA-SIG. Today is our long-awaited July 2021 event, and we have a ridiculously awesome presentation coming up today, so I hope y'all are as excited as and ready as I am. As usual, let me just go through some housekeeping items. So this event is being recorded and it's going to be uploaded into our DBA page after the event. If you're here for CEUs, there's going to be a Google form where you sign in and out. And I'm going to send out the sign in right after I finish talking. And you can, if you can, please complete the sign in within 5 minutes from now in order to be eligible for your CEUs. And the same process is going to happen at the end. So at the end of the presentation, a sign out form is going to be sent out before the end of the presentation. Just make sure to sign out.
I'm sorry.
So if you want to just make sure to sign out within 5 minutes of the presentation ending, that would be great. And today's event is going to count for 1.5 BACB Type 2 learning CEs. And of course, we're still going to be kind of just checking attendance throughout the presentation. So if you have any connection issues, get logged out, any of that, shoot us an email, let us know, and just make sure your full name is displayed on Zoom. So if you're on a phone or anything like that, just make sure to let us know what phone number you used. And so today we are going to be asking everyone to keep their microphones and their cameras off, just to limit any distractions that might pop up. However, chat box is always open, so go ahead and send your questions, comments, praises, whatever in the chat. And I'll make sure to jot down any questions for our speaker, and I'm sure she's going to answer any and all questions you have. And finally, I'm going to take a deep breath, and I get to do the best part of passing y'all off to our speaker today. Y'all are in for a super duper treat because she is presenting on a really hot topic. And I think we're really, really lucky to have snagged her. And with that, I'm going to hand you off to Dr. Katie Saint, and I'm going to turn off my camera in 3, 2, 1.
All right, well, thank you so much, guys. I'm really excited to be here. I'm passionate about this subject. I feel like it's really important for BCBAs to learn about how we can ethically help mental health. A lot of our training kind of teaches us that they're two totally separate silos, and they're really not as separate as we think. So I'm hoping that after listening to this presentation, you'll have some ideas as to how you can help address mental health and how you can do it ethically within your scope in a way that is totally under the BCBA umbrella. So I will dive in. So just to start with a little bit about myself, just recently the STAR assessment has been published. I'm very excited about this. We have an online app and you can buy a hard copy for this. And this helps to assess people's readiness to live independently. So this is an assessment that also has a curriculum guide that goes with it. So you can assess your young adult skills and then have curriculum to train them how to do the ones they don't have. So then I have awkward, the social do's and don'ts, when grandparents divorce, autism in lockdown, and autism and depression. So I got my PhD from the Chicago School of Professional Psychology in ABA, and then I have a dual master's in community counseling and ABA, and I teach at Pepperdine University, as well as having a private practice where I do mental health counseling. I work with clients with anxiety, depression, bipolar, schizophrenia, trauma, and then I'm the training director at Fox Valley Autism. So I like to do a variety of things. So that's just a little bit of background on me. As I present today, please feel free to interrupt, ask questions. I love for things to be interactive. So if questions come up, I'd love to hear from you guys. So our outline for today, the hope is that you guys are going to gain an understanding of common dual diagnoses and what to do about it, and understanding of how these extra diagnoses interact with autism, and how parents' mental health plays a part in their treatment, And then understanding the boundaries around, if you're a BCBA implementing therapy with these dual diagnoses, what do you do about it? How do you treat that ethically? So this graph here was pretty surprising to me when I first discovered it. When we look at the dual diagnoses that go along with autism, it's really high. So you can see here, GI issues is at 60%. And more research is coming out right now that there is a link between the gut and the brain. And so having gut issues often correlates with having increased mental health issues. So more research needs to be done as to why that is, but that's just an interesting link. 64% of clients have or people with autism have allergies. And so when we're thinking about their sensory issues and stuff like that, that's just going to amplify them. So that can contribute to some of those problem behaviors too, if they're having these internal events. 39% has skin issues, 15% has seizures, asthma is really high. But if you skip down to anxiety, that's at 67%. So that's super high. In order to have autism and anxiety, that means your anxiety needs to be so high and it's causing such a disruption that it warrants a separate diagnosis, because otherwise anxiety is part of the autism diagnosis. So it needs to be pretty extreme. So according to this stat, adults are at 67%. So the next one, depression, is at 72%. Now this one was really sad to me because so many clients have told me about how they've gone to mental health counselors and they've sought counseling for their depression, but the counselor wouldn't treat them because they said, I don't have experience with autism, so I don't feel qualified treating your depression. So there's very few mental health counselors with training in how to help people with autism with depression. And as you can see here, 72% is sky high. So that's part of the reason I wrote the book, Autism and Depression. I wanted there to be a resource out there for people to use if they didn't have access to an actual counselor who felt qualified. But after today's presentation, I'm hoping you guys are all going to feel a little bit more equipped to help with that as well. So ABA is actually really awesome at helping with mental health. ABA is really good at teaching skills. And the research shows us that there's several skill deficits that lead to depression. And so we can target those skill deficits, and that's going to help people's mental health. ABA can address motivation barriers. So when somebody is struggling with depression, their chemicals in their body are off balance. And we'll get more into this later, but dopamine is one of those chemicals that cause us to feel unmotivated. We lack happiness and satisfaction when we're low on dopamine. And if you're struggling with depression, that means your dopamine levels are low. So what's good about ABA then is we can compensate for that lack of motivation. We can compensate for the low levels of dopamine. We are experts at figuring out how to motivate people. So we can be especially helpful with those clients who have severe depression that are just really struggling to motivate themselves. So ABA can produce chemicals that fight depression. And so we're going to get more into that later. But it's really cool how behavior and chemicals in our mind, it all interacts. And so once we know what behaviors to target, we can be really effective. And once we get people's internal events not serving as a barrier, you're going to see them mastering goals faster. So ABA can shape positive behaviors. ABA can teach how to cope with difficult emotions. And ABA can reduce problem behaviors that lead to pain and emotional distress. So we are really, really effective at treating mental health. And so we just need training on how we do it and how we do it ethically. But all BCBAs have the basic skill sets. once you get certified. So let's just look a little bit at how to tell if someone with autism has depression. It can be confusing sometimes because sometimes the symptoms overlap or look the same. It's common for people with autism to have social communication issues, rigid behavior, eating issues, sleep issues. But it's also common for people who are struggling with depression to have lack of motivation, to be socially withdrawn, eating issues, low energy, low self-esteem, difficulty making decisions. But what we want to look for is not just these symptoms in and of itself. We want to look for behavior change. So let's say this person that you really care about or your client used to chat your ear off about trains. They would talk to you for an hour straight about trains, and suddenly they just don't. They're withdrawn. You ask them about trains, they don't want to talk about it. That'd be more concerning. Or they used to eat really good and now they don't, or now they're sleeping all the time. So we want to look for these pattern changes in order to kind of suspect if it's depression or not. So typically someone's gonna make a change in one of these areas. And really you're gonna see that those energy levels lower, the motivation lowering, loss of interest, things like that. So those are kind of some signs that you might see if someone's struggling with depression. So let's talk about suicide. This is a really tough subject. So we can apply functions of behavior to suicide, but sometimes we have to be really careful with applying our interventions. So ultimately, suicide is escape behavior, right? Somebody is feeling hopeless, somebody is feeling like they want escape from an internal event, maybe the pain they're feeling, or maybe they want to escape from an external event. And so suicidal talk in and of itself can serve its own function. That can be attention seeking sometimes. It can be to serve a tangible function, or it can also be escape. So those are things to kind of pay attention to. But ultimately, we need to ensure safety, and we can't take risks thinking, oh, this is attention seeking behavior, so I'm going to ignore it. So first things first, if somebody is having suicidal talk, we need to assess safety. We need to figure out, can they hurt themselves right now? And so once we ensure safety, then we can kind of look more at what's going on beyond that. So we don't want to give a ton of attention to it at first. To share a story of what I mean by that, I had a 12-year-old client who had a single mom, and she was a really amazing mom. But one day the boy was at school and he made some suicidal comments to his teacher and took a knife and actually started cutting at his wrist. He made some scratches. He didn't cut deep, but his mom canceled work. He got sent home from school. She spent the day with him, and then he got a counselor that he really loved. And this was a really powerful event for him. His mom has to work so much. And so just to pay the bills, keep things afloat. And so he's like, whoa, I can say these things and my mom will come home from work and spend the day with me. Like, this is awesome. So it was really tough because school responded in a way that schools typically do, where they're like, whoa, this is serious. This is suicide talk. We need to bring in the mom. We need to do all these things to ensure safety. But that was highly reinforcing to the student. So we needed to come up with a treatment plan that didn't get him attention from suicidal talk, but it got him attention in a different way. And so what we did is we started scheduling some proactive one-on-one time with him and his mom. And then in the moment when he would start talking about suicide, we would ensure safety, but we wouldn't give attention to it. And so when the moment was over, then we would come back and we would talk to him about it. So we wanted there to be a separation from that moment and when we started talking about it. So it wasn't effective as escape behavior in the moment or attention seeking behavior in the moment. So through time, we were able to decrease his suicide talk. We were able to replace it with healthy attention seeking behavior and the proactive strategy of scheduling and planning one-on-one time with mom also decreased the motivation for this problem attention seeking behavior. So we always want to ask those three questions. Do they have the intent to hurt themselves? Do they actually have the means to hurt themselves? And do they have a plan? So if a client says yes to all three of these things, then I seek hospitalization. But if they don't say yes to all three of these things, then I might work with them a little bit more and work with their family to ensure safety before hospitalization. If you refer out to a counselor, it's really valuable that you coordinate with them. I've worked with some counselors that really give anti-ABA advice. So for example, one counselor recommended that to address the child's anxiety, that you just, anytime he's anxious, just keep him home, keep him home, keep him home. And so of course we know from an ABA perspective that that's reinforcing escape. And so his anxiety went through the roof and his escape behavior was sky high too. So that was not an effective strategy to address that. So that's why you really want to choose your counselors carefully to make sure that what they're recommending is in line with what we do and what the science says is actually really effective. So going.
Katie. Oh, sorry,
Yeah.
really quick. We do have a question regarding the last slide.
Yeah.
So they're wondering, what should they do if it sounds like the counselor is recommending an anti-ABA, a process or intervention, and they're also receiving ABA services. What would you do in that case?
Sure. That's so hard when that happens because we never want to bash other professionals. Hopefully, we have a really good relationship with parents so that we can kind of talk through that. One thing I like to do to address it proactively is talk to parents about it and say, like, okay, I think we should get a mental health counselor involved. But I want you to know that this is what the science says about what's going to be effective. And some counselors recommend things that contradict. So if that comes up, I would like to discourage you from following that advice. So, for example, if we're working with anxiety, we know that if we avoid anxiety, that makes it grow and that it reinforces problem behavior. So if your counselor recommends that, I would strongly encourage you not to follow that. Or when it comes to depression, the same thing applies, where the more we isolate, the more we escape, even though that's comfortable in the moment, that makes it worse. So if your counselor recommends things like that, I would really encourage you not to follow it. So it's a little bit easier if you can have that conversation proactively. Once it happens, then hopefully you can kind of talk through the science and why that maybe wouldn't be recommended. But it's so important that we have good relationships with other professionals in who we collaborate with. So we wouldn't want to burn a bridge or like come on too strongly about they're wrong and that's not okay. So sometimes we have to, like, if the parents really want to follow that advice, we can just take data on it and see how it's going. And then after a couple of weeks, if things are getting worse, then that kind of opens the door for us to say, like, okay, seems like things aren't working. So maybe can we try this? Or, I would recommend us trying this because the research says that this would be really effective to address what we're trying to do here. So I guess that's what I would recommend if you run into that situation. It can be so hard to navigate when two professionals are recommending contradicting advice, but yeah. Mm-hmm. So let's look at dopamine. So this is a really powerful chemical And it's also the chemical that causes addictive behaviors too. So there's healthy ways to get dopamine and there's unhealthy ways to get dopamine. So exercise and sex is a healthy way to get dopamine. Healthy relationships is the most powerful way to get dopamine. And so what happens when you get dopamine from healthy relationships is it causes a curve, a nice, steady, slow curve, where exercise and sex, for example, causes more of a spike. So that if you have regular interaction with healthy relationships, this is really going to help you. So I've had many clients tell me, I don't need friends, I'm happy alone, and like I don't want to be social. But the research says that that's not true. Every human alive needs connection. And so we get sick faster. Um, in general, our mental and physical health is way worse if we don't have those solid, healthy relationships. So if your client is telling you they're happy alone, science says that it's just not true. So another thing that you can do to help someone produce dopamine is doing things that line up with their values. And so this is literally anything they value. So if they value Pokemon, like get them doing that. Having several things that they're doing every day that are healthy, that lines up with their values, this is going to help them produce a healthy level of dopamine. So now I'm going to go into the unhealthy sources that cause more of an addictive pattern. So sweet and salty foods, pain, and drugs and alcohol all cause dopamine to spike really high and then crash even lower than they started. So it becomes an addictive pattern because those things are the solution to the crash, right? So your dopamine levels spiked really low, and then you ate food again, you ate that sweet and salty snack, and it spiked right back up. So that's why people get themselves into this cycle. So perhaps you know somebody who's a cutter. They cut their wrists or they cut their legs or, wherever it is, they're harming themselves. Part of the reason that is so common is because to compensate with the pain, your body releases dopamine to kind of balance things out. So it numbs their emotional pain for a little bit. And so it gives them this dopamine high, but then it crashes them even lower than when they started. So that's why they want to do it again. Their brain is unconsciously telling them, hey, this worked in the past. Respondent conditioning told me that this got rid of your unpleasant internal event. So let's do it again. So the same is true for drugs and alcohol. So we want to get people into a daily habit of doing the healthy ones. So exercise, healthy relationships, doing things that line up with your values. So now we're going to go into some of the other chemicals that are really good for our mental health. So we already talked about dopamine. Oxytocin is what makes us feel connected. We release a huge dose of this when we're breastfeeding, but people can get oxytocin from all sorts of different ways: playing with kids or animals, giving a compliment, physical touch. So this kind of makes you feel satisfied, it makes you feel connected, sentimental. So this is one of the important chemicals that helps us feel good about life. Serotonin is the emotion that kind of helps us regulate our emotions. And so this is really valuable if you have a client who's just struggling with emotional regulation and they just snap at like just super easy. They might be low on serotonin. And so sunlight, exercise, being in nature, those things produce that chemical in their body. So just getting them involved in those kind of activities can help with emotional regulation. So next one is endorphins. So this helps us fight and cope with stress. This is a balancing chemical for when we get stressed out and when we are overwhelmed with life. If we have enough endorphins in our system, we're going to handle it much better. So laughter, dancing, creativity, This might sound silly to you guys, but actually programming, teaching a client to be silly is really good for their mental health. A lot of people are uncomfortable with being silly and acting goofy, but if you can get people comfortable with that and doing that on a regular basis, they're going to fight stress and they're going to just be able to cope with life better. So it's worth targeting as a goal. So now I want to talk about the brain a little bit and self-esteem and all of that. So we have our prefrontal cortex, that's where our logic and our reasoning happens. We have our amygdala. This is our fight or flight response. This is what produces that really big anxiety. And then we have the hippocampus that stores all of our memories. So I was at a conference once where we got to actually dissect the brain, and it was so crazy. I was holding a man's hippocampus in my hands. Like, oh my gosh, I'm holding this man's entire memories. So it was wild. But these three parts of the brain play a big part in how we respond to stress, to mental health stuff. So the research shows on autism that the amygdala is actually larger in people with autism compared to people without. And that means it's also more active. So if your amygdala is triggered more often, then that means you're going to have the fight, flight, or freeze response more often. So your brain is telling you, protect yourself, something bad is going to happen. And then your hippocampus stores that information. So let's say you go to the grocery store, you have a panic moment, then your hippocampus stores that information. So now between the two of those parts of your brain, they're telling you, stay away from the grocery store. That was not a good place. That was really bad. So what we're going to see with behaviors then is avoidant behavior. We're going to see that escape behavior where they're doing what they can to avoid the grocery store because they know last time they were there, it was a bad experience. So when your amygdala is really activated, it cuts off access to the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is what's going to talk your brain down and be like, it's okay. It's okay. You don't need to freak out right now. This is safe. I know you're scared, but it's okay. And so when we're looking at the research of what the brain looks like with people with autism, there's actually less connectors that help the prefrontal cortex communicate to the amygdala. What's cool though about behaviors and ABA is that we can actually physically build those connections. So when we're helping clients self-reflect, when we're doing exposure therapy and helping clients work through those things that they're afraid of, the brain is rebuilding itself and making those connections. So the more we do this, the more the prefrontal cortex can communicate with the amygdala and tell the amygdala, it's okay. You don't need to protect me right now. This is a safe place. But it takes a lot of repetitions to build the brain. So something to think about with all of this too is rule-governed behavior and self-esteem. So a lot of times when someone has compassion for somebody with anxiety, they want to protect them, right? Like, I see you are freaking out right now. I see you had a panic attack. I don't want you to go through that ever again. That was clearly miserable. But what that communicates then is you can't handle that. You're not strong enough. And so then a lot of times people create this rule-governed behavior that I'll fail if I go into that situation. I will not be successful. So it creates a reflexive MO where they're like, I need to prevent these bad things from happening. So I'm going to isolate and I'm going to hide and I'm not going to face these things because I won't be successful. So that's where exposure therapy and systematic desensitization is so important to fight that. So people aren't making these conclusions about themselves or making these learning patterns in their brain where they're like, nope, I can't handle that. I won't be successful. We have to prove to them through repetition and through their behaviors that they can handle it and they can be successful. So now I want to switch gears and talk a little bit about ADHD. As mentioned earlier, this is really commonly diagnosed with autism. And it's similar to autism in that it is a lifelong disorder. This is not something that we can cure, but it's definitely something that we can manage and get to a really functional place. So the research says that lifelong, you will need shorter contingencies. So if you're making a reward system that is like 2 weeks out or a month out for someone with an ADHD diagnosis, it's really not likely to work no matter how old the client is. So we need more immediate contingencies for those really challenging behaviors. Um, the research says that the combination of drugs and ABA treatment is the most effective way to treat ADHD. So medication helps with the impulsivity, with the focus, things like that. But I'm sure, as you guys have experienced, sometimes people need to experiment with a few different drugs to figure out what drug works best for them. But another cool thing about the brain and about ABA therapy is we can build some of the areas where they have deficits in. So executive functioning skills are all part of the prefrontal cortex. And so if through repetition and practice, we work on those skills a lot, we're going to improve them. Somebody with ADHD typically struggles with all of the executive functioning skills, organizing, prioritizing, shifting thinking, accessing working memory, and self-monitoring. All of that stuff can be really hard for someone with ADHD. But if we practice those things, they can improve, and it actually physically rebuilds their brain and makes it stronger and builds those connections so their brain can communicate. So practice and repetition is what's really effective here. Additionally, now that we have all these technology apps and different things like that, that's been hugely helpful for people with ADHD. A lot of times we need alarms set and reminders and all that kind of thing. So what we need to keep in mind when we're working with someone with ADHD is this is something they're going to have to do their whole life. So they can't be dependent on you for the reminders. We want to teach our clients to be independent in this way. We want to teach them how to set up contingencies, how to set up reminders, and all of these things so that if they can't rely on their memory, they have all these other safeties in place. So that's one thing that therapists accidentally do a lot is their clients are dependent on them for the reminders. So we want to put that on the clients more so that they can be independent and they can function without our support. So now I want to talk about ODD. This is really common. It's a hard diagnosis to work with because they are often really defiant and oppositional, and sometimes reward systems are not effective because they're like, what, you want me to earn that? Well, then I don't want it. So that can be challenging, but there's a lot of ways to work around that. So one thing to just focus on is avoiding the power struggle. We really want to partner with our ODD kids or adults. We want them to feel like we're in it with them, not an authority figure. The more we come down hard as I'm the boss and you need to listen to me, the more they're going to kind of fight us on it. So give them choices. Make your expectations consistent. If they are inconsistent, that just gives them a reason to fight and argue. If you're unpredictable with your expectations, it's going to be really hard for someone with ODD to accept. Word things in a positive way. So say, for example, you want them to quit playing video games because it's time to eat lunch. Don't say to them like, okay, time to be done with video games. Instead, word it as, okay, it's time for lunch, come join us. So then you're focusing on the positive, like, hey, you have this positive event that it's time for now, versus, hey, stop doing this thing you really like. Offer help. Sometimes we can do it with them, or help them through it. So again, we're partnering with them rather than coming down hard as an authority figure. Don't forget shaping and accepting approximations. So even if something isn't a skill deficit, say it's a compliance issue, we can still use shaping to say like, okay, I'm going to accept this approximation. And when you start doing this level for a certain amount of time, then I will raise my expectations. And so we can use that shaping procedure in order to get to our end goal faster, because sometimes our end goal is too high of a goal. So it's just going to trigger that defensiveness and that escape behavior. But if we take smaller steps, then we'll get there more successfully. So use visual supports. This can be effective because a lot of times people with ODD respond defensively to verbal instruction that comes from a person. But if they get it as a visual support, then they're less defensive to it. So this can be helpful with like morning routines or, different visual reminders like that. Be so mindful of your tone of voice. If you have an attitude in your tone of voice, that's just going to trigger their defensiveness. So try to remain calm, try to remain positive, and this is going to help your interaction be more positive. If they start arguing, which is a really common thing that people with ODD typically do, don't engage. Arguing reinforces arguing, right? So if you don't have someone to argue with, you're not going to keep arguing. So make your expectations clear and disengage. Use first then, again, so your expectations are super clear, and stick to it. And take advantage of behavioral momentum. Like if there's certain things they're willing to do that they like, do those things first and then have the more challenging task after that. And remember, with behavioral momentum, you got to go kind of fast in order to get the momentum to build on itself. If there's a delay in between, you're going to lose that momentum. So now I want to talk a little bit about ACT therapy. So I love ACT therapy. I actually did my dissertation on it. And I feel like in some ways it really helps us to bridge the gap between mental health and ABA. Some behavior analysts are a little bit scared off by ACT because they're worried that it's maybe too mentalistic or not ABA enough. So what this slide here is about is just kind of breaking down the 6 processes of ACT and how they are ABA based. So the kind of the center of ACT therapy is values. So this is where we kind of focus on like what people care about, and then tie their behaviors to that value. So from an ABA perspective, we can look at values as rules that summarize actions that lead to powerful delayed reinforcers. And I would argue too that sometimes values are immediate too. So for example, I've been talking for a while now. So I had an MO of not having any water, and talking makes me more thirsty. So now one of my values in this moment is I want to drink water, and it's a powerful reinforcer. So values can be immediate like that as well, where maybe a long-term value of mine is I want to be a healthy person and I want to be fit or something like that, so that would be more of a long-term value. So the next one is present moment awareness. Sometimes people call this mindfulness. And this is super, super important because if we're not aware of ourselves, of our behavior, of the contingencies in our environment, it's going to be hard for us to reach our reinforcers. It's going to be hard for us to change our behaviors. So the ABA way of looking at present moment awareness is behavior that's under the control of stimulus in the current environment. And so we want to train people to be aware of their behaviors. So like if we ask a kid, I want you to stop interrupting your friends, right? So that's the behavior we're targeting. If they don't even realize when they're doing it, it's going to be hard for them to change those behaviors. And if they're not self-aware enough to see how their friends are getting mad, their friends are disengaging from them because they're interrupting so much, then they don't see the negative consequences that are associated with their behavior. So through present moment awareness, we're training them to be in the moment, to notice those contingencies, so they can be more self-aware and they can change their behavior. And through being mindful of these things, it should increase their motivation as well, because they see, oh, there's more consequences to this than I realized. So acceptance is a super powerful process of ACT. And I love it because I think this is the barrier for a lot of people. Everything that you love in life comes with a cost, right? Like if you went to school, you really wanted to be a behavior analyst, but you had to sacrifice some time, money, energy, maybe some relationships paid a little bit of a price, right? So once we clearly see the connection between this thing that we really value and the cost, this thing we don't like, if we can connect those together, it is a lot easier to accept that that you have to deal with that. So for example, sometimes I'll use my client's desire for controlling other people. I'll say something to them like, hey, I know you really want people to listen to you and to follow your rules, but if you yell and scream at them, they're just going to avoid you and they're not going to want to listen to you. If you're nice to them, if you're sweet, then they're more likely to want to do what you have to say. So, using their values in that moment can help get them on board. Diffusion addresses internal events. And so this one's really, really powerful for working through all of these internal barriers, teaching people that, yeah, you're scared right now, or you're tired, or you're hungry, but you can still do it anyway, and here's how. So the ABA definition of diffusion is separating rule governance from contingency-shaped behavior in order to not block access to reinforce it. So basically, people are making rule-governed behavior about their internal events, right? I am tired, therefore I can't work out. So if we can change those rules and help people understand that that's not a rule they have to follow. They can do things scared. They can do things tired, and they'll be okay. In fact, they can just bring these things with them and it'll be all right. The research shows that if we try to stuff our emotions and avoid them, the intensity and the frequency increases. So it really doesn't help to avoid them. So next is contextual self. So this is the perspective taking process of ACT. And this is where we bring in relational frame theory. So relational frame theory is really cool because once we connect things, it can transform the function. And once the function is transformed, people take things that were previously punishing, now they're reinforcing them and they're willing to do them. Like, what's that? If I polish this car, my boss is going to think I'm super awesome and I'm going to get a raise. You bet I'd be happy to polish this car. So when we make those connections, then suddenly we're motivated to do things we otherwise wouldn't be. So the ABA definition of this one is using relational frames such as I, here, now to determine the function of behaviors to increase behavior towards powerful delayed reinforcement. So then the last one is just committed action. And this is what everybody who's a behavior analyst loves because it's operational definitions and contingency management. So you go through all of these processes and you think about, okay, what is going to get me to my values? What is the most powerful behaviors that I can do today that's actually going to get me to move towards where I want to go? So this is where we make really specific plans, not just I'm going to eat healthy. It's okay, I'm going to the store and I'm going to buy these 5 foods today. We want to make those really specific plans. So the literature on ACT shows that it increases distress tolerance. It's really helpful with impulse control. This is an example from my dissertation of a employee who was struggling with depression, anxiety, and his work performance was really low. So you can see here from this chart, once he started using ACT strategies, his behavior drastically improved. So his paperwork got turned in on time, his weekly contact with clients started happening at a 100% level, and his value-based mindful checks, he started doing them 3 times a day. And so this really, really helped him. When we look at his chart here, mindflex.org lets you take a quiz that assesses your inflexibility, your distress, and then the positive traits, your flexibility and well-being. So before he started the ACT interventions, he was off the charts in a lot of areas for notably impaired. And you can see here that after the intervention, he got to good or advanced levels of functioning in these areas. So it had a pretty drastic effect on him. What's interesting is after my dissertation was over, maybe 6 months or so, he quit using some of the ACT strategies, and a lot of these things came back. So it showed he needed to continue those things in order to maintain this. So looking at the social validity here, you can see that using these ACT strategies, people had some pretty great impact on both their behavior, their mental health, and just overall wellness. For example, 10% of the participants in my study, their doctors actually took them off medication for depression. Because through ACT therapy, they started incorporating all those behaviors we talked about earlier that produce chemicals that fight mental health. And so they were in a really good place. People talked about reducing burnout. About 90% of the participants were less burnt out after using ACT. They were able to problem solve their barriers. Feelings of insecurity and depression decreased. So this was really, really effective for improving their behaviors and their mental health. So how do we train mental health? From a genetics background, there is some genetics components to it. If your mom had anxiety, if your grandma had anxiety, you're likely to have it too. But there's also an operant component to that where they're teaching you those behaviors. They're kind of teaching you to react in an anxious way. So we learn it and our behaviors get reinforced in our environment too. Respondent conditioning can shape our mental health. So we see this a lot with abuse and things like that. Culture can shape our mental health. Sometimes in culture, so take for example, right now culture pushes us to be so busy, and so it is not good for our mental health to go nonstop, right? So that's an example of how culture can hurt your mental health. Or how about like body image? That's a struggle for most women, and part of the reason for that is culture, right? All these images of perfect bodies where we see our flaws and we're like, oh gosh, well, I don't look like her, so I must not be attractive, so culture can play a big part. And then lastly is relational frames, right? So who we compare ourselves to, if they're better than, if we're worse than, all of those relational frames, like I'll only be enough if, so we make these connections, we make these associations of I'm good enough if I have these traits, and all of that can hurt our mental health. But we can reframe that and we can work through that with our ABA training. We can teach people how to do this differently and how to recondition our brains to get over some of the things that we were trained in our past. So some mental health basics: bad sleep, working too much, inactivity, eating bad, and never saying no. Those things are just going to hurt anybody's mental health. So as a behavior analyst, you can easily target those things with your clients and help them get better at doing those things. And so then naturally their mental health will improve. Setting boundaries, taking time off work, moving your body, getting creative, eating food as fuel, all of those things are really going to help our mental health. And so we should target them with our clients, help our clients get into a solid habit of doing these things. So what does trauma look like? So it looks like an avocado. So basically on the outside, we're going to see this behavior. It's going to be defensive. It's going to be a behavior that withdraws from people, or it's going to be really people pleasing because they learn through respondent conditioning or operant conditioning that if I please people, I'm less likely to get hurt, right? So you're going to see either one of those extremes where they're pushing people away because they've learned people aren't safe, or they're people pleasing because they're like, if I can just make people happy, then I'll be okay and safe. Then we're going to see internal events: anxiety, depression, headaches, stomachache issues, detached, apathetic. So that's kind of what's going to be going on internal with them. But then when we look at the core of it, like where did all of this come from? Comes from operant and respondent conditioning, right? Relationships are paired with punishment. Setting boundaries has been punished. Now you have these really powerful reflexive MOs that are teaching you, like, you need to protect yourself. Bad things are going to happen. And so then you're going to have all this rule governed behavior around protecting yourself instead of growing and connecting with people. So this is kind of the profile of someone who's struggling with trauma. But as behavior analysts, we know what to do when someone makes an association or goes through operant conditioning. We know how to fix that. We can make new connections. We can train new patterns and make new associations so they learn how to be healthy and how to connect, and that they're safe and that they actually don't need to protect themselves anymore. So our past pain, whatever that might be, creates escape behavior. And so sometimes this can be good and sometimes this can be bad. So when it's bad, we isolate and we don't try. Like, I'm not going to do that because I'll fail, right? So that can be kind of the mentality. But if we can train our clients and ourselves that, okay, I had this past pain, but I'm going to use that as motivation. And I'm going to start learning. I'm going to start practicing new skills. I'm going to better myself so I can overcome this. So then we can take a proactive approach to our pain rather than a passive isolation response to our pain. So motivating operations plays a big part in anxiety. So we have these reflexive MOs, right? So a reflexive MO predicts that something bad is going to happen. And so then we are motivated to do something in order to prevent that from happening. But the problem is this can be falsely reinforcing. So say you're really afraid of something bad happening, so you avoid it and it doesn't happen. You're like, whew, that worked. I avoided it. Nothing bad happened. But maybe in reality, nothing bad would have happened. So if you would have actually gone and shown up, then you could have experienced operant conditioning, training your brain that I'm okay, this is safe, this isn't something I have to be afraid of. But when we get that false reinforcement of, bad thing didn't happen, we think that's right. We think that was the right choice. And so that's how our anxiety grows sometimes. So a surrogate MO is when we associate things together. So we're going to see this in therapy sometimes where a kid has an aversion to something and we're like, why the heck does he not like this? Why is he so defensive about this thing? And maybe it's because he got associated, or that thing got associated with a bad event. So like I mentioned earlier, people with autism have their hippocampus is really strong. So maybe you've experienced this, that you've met people with just these incredible memories. You're like, holy cow, that's so awesome. You remember that. So that can happen in good and bad ways. So maybe they got abused one time. And that day, maybe their brain could have recorded the colors people were wearing, the type of day it was, like all these details about that event. And then moving forward, they could have a surrogate MO where they're like, oh, that's associated with bad things. I feel defensive. I don't want to go there. So they make that connection where those two things are associated and it triggers escape behavior. So we need that exposure therapy to help them see that they're safe and it's okay. So helping them work through that in a loving way. Like, you're okay. I'm going to walk with you through this and you're going to see that you're safe and you're okay. So when we're thinking about reports and insurance companies, we do not want to use any mentalistic terms. So for example, you should not say in a report, client will identify when they are feeling depressed and why, in 80% of opportunities across 1 month. We don't want to talk like that in reports. They're not going to be approved. But we can help mental health and we can address depression by saying, client will engage in 10 minutes of social interaction and 15 of physical exercise, 15 minutes of physical exercise per day, 80% of opportunities across 1 month. So if we just describe the behaviors, we're gonna get reports accepted. And what's cool about that is behaviors are the base of this stuff. We build those chemicals, we fight depression. When we have a healthy routine of these behaviors, it really, really helps our mental health. So don't say things like client will not act impulsively. We don't want to use the word impulsively in reports, so we're gonna look for ways to word things behaviorally to address some of those mental health issues. So now I want to switch gears to talking about parents, because their mental health is a big part of whether or not they're going to follow through. And the research on parents with kids with special needs is really sad, honestly. It really talks about how much parents are struggling, how much they are maxed out, and they're feeling like they can't do it all. They're feeling like they don't have enough support. They never get a break. And so sometimes behavior analysts come in there and they're like, why aren't you following through? Like, if you just followed through, I could solve this problem for you. So behavior analysts get frustrated too, because they're like, I want to help you, but I need you to follow through, right? So there's just like a gap that happens sometimes. But we can bridge that gap once we can clearly see what parents are up against. So have a conversation with parents about what are your competing punishment for following the behavior plan. So I wrote this behavior plan for you. If you follow it, what's the cost? What's going to play out? So sometimes parents will tell me, well, I might not be able to cook dinner because he is going to be so mad that I said no, and he's going to throw a big tantrum. And then I won't be able to help his sister with her homework because I'm going to have to deal with this tantrum for an hour. And so I'm just going to run out of time in my day and I'm not going to be able to do everything. Right? So sometimes if we get a clear picture of what they're up against, that's really going to help us tailor a plan to their environment that's doable, rather than just assuming that given their situation, they can do this. The next thing to look at is, what reinforcement do parents receive in the immediate for follow through? Sometimes there is no reinforcement at first. Sometimes it takes a while before parents experience the benefits of our behavior plans. So keep this in mind and mentally prepare parents for this, because that can be so defeating if you're like, okay, I just spent a week following through with this and I haven't seen the results yet. Where if they expect like, okay, this is going to take a couple of weeks, then that'll be easier for them to accept. Next, what competing values make it hard to follow the behavior plan? I've had many parents that have told me, I feel like my purpose as a parent is to make my child happy. Or I feel awful that my child has a disability. And so I just feel so guilty making them cry, right? So if part of my behavior plan is teaching parents to say no to their child and actually follow through with it, that feels so wrong to them. So that's where we need to use relational frame theory, and we need to teach them, like, okay, right now your kid's happiness is not as good as it could be because they're having tantrums and they're having meltdowns. And so if you start setting boundaries and saying no to them and following through with them, through with that, it actually is going to make them happier. The research shows us that kids are happier when their parents set clear and consistent boundaries. There's a research article I love to tell parents about. They did this study where they let kids play on a playground, and one playground had a fence and one playground didn't have a fence. So the playground without a fence, kids played on 50% less of the playground. The one with the fence, they played on the whole thing. So kids benefit from boundaries. They are happier, they are less anxious, they are more secure. So help your parents see how your behavior plan is going to help their kid be happier. So lastly, do parents get any social reinforcement or punishment from following through? So this is something I've seen too, where parents criticize each other, or they're not on the same page, and that can be a really tough barrier too. So try to get a full picture of what your parents are up against so you can support them, and you can try to problem solve and compensate for some of these things they're facing that makes it really hard to follow through. Um, More to keep in mind when it comes to parents' mental health is their anxiety. So sometimes parents will have anxious behavior towards us, and sometimes that feels bad. So what that looks like for parents when they're trying to manage their anxiety, some of that behavior presents as controlling the situation or other people. Sometimes they're overly productive. Sometimes they're avoidance of tasks and just won't do them. Sometimes they criticize others or you, or sometimes they ask for a ton of feedback. So if you keep this in mind, that these are likely escape behaviors for anxiety, they're trying to quiet these internal events. They maybe have a reflexive MO that if they don't do these things, something really bad is going to happen. So if you kind of keep that in the back of your head, it's easier to not take it personal. And then we can help address some of those fears, and maybe we can quiet that reflexive MO and help them to see that's really not something they have to be afraid of. I love to do parent value assessments. I think this really helps with buy-in, and this addresses their mental health. So I ask them questions, and definitely schedule a decent amount of time for this so you can connect and have a full conversation. But ask them, like, is there anything you cannot do that you wish you could because of the needs of your child? What do you think would improve your family life? If your child did less of blank, you could bond with them more often. If your child did less of blank, your child would be more happy. So use these questions to help the parents kind of explore what behaviors you can target that would be most powerful. So then once you go through this parent value assessment with them and just ask them all these questions, then explain to them, like, okay, these are the behaviors that I'm going to target to help you achieve those things that you just said you really, really value. And here's what it's going to require of us. The research tells us that if we're going to master these goals and accomplish these things, this is what the therapists have to do, and this is what the family has to do. Is that something you're comfortable with? Are you okay with that? So right off the bat, we're spelling out for them, hey, this is what it takes to achieve that goal. Are you in? And I found this helps so much because we're speaking to their pain. We're telling them, like, hey, I recognize you're struggling in this area, and I can help you. I can partner with you, and here's what it's going to take. right? So that's easier for parents to accept rather than not really knowing how it benefits them, or just having this like vague general, I know ABA therapy is good for my kid and I know it'll generally help them, but if we give them specific things to tie it to, like you'll be able to take your kid to a restaurant and that's going to be super cool. Or you can start bringing your kid to your family events now, and you won't have to leave early because they're having problem behaviors. Tie it to things that the parents care about, and you're going to get a lot more buy-in. So to conclude, ABA is awesome at addressing mental health. And in some ways, I would even argue that ABA can be more effective because we're so good at compensating for the motivation impact, and we're so good at knowing how to target skills and increase them. So we just need to know what to target. So consider people's history of learning. Their conditioning is really going to make a big impact on how defensive they are or how they respond to treatment. Consider the speed of reinforcement. When we have a dual diagnosis, typically we need more powerful reinforcers and more frequent reinforcers. Consider people's MOs, and target behaviors that are going to give people most powerful access to reinforcement. So that is it for my presentation. I want to open it up to questions. If you guys want to contact me, my email is on here. It's katyjsaint@gmail.com. If you liked this event and are interested in more, you can also follow me on Instagram. My name on there is Dr. Behavior Boss. It's meant to be silly. But yeah, you can follow me on there, and I post like CEUs and different educational things as well. So thanks so much for coming today, and let me know if you have any questions. I'm happy to answer them now.
Okay, perfect. That was such a fun and amazing presentation. We did get some questions throughout the presentation, so if it's okay, Katie, if I can just kind of go in order.
Absolutely.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so I did have one that was asking, I am not a BCBA, but I am in school for my master's in counseling, and I plan to also become a BCBA.
Cool.
My current BCBA supervisor does not want to utilize ACT because they say it is not behavior analytic and is not a strong supporter of mental health. Do you have any suggestions on how I can talk to them about this, or is this something I should just keep my head down about?
Well, balancing that relationship is really important. You don't want to be offensive about it. I would actually be happy to share a PowerPoint I have with you. There's also some really good articles by like Steve Hayes and other people that talk about this is how ABA, how ACT is based in ABA. So like I mentioned in my presentation, there is a group of people out there who aren't trained on how ACT is based in ABA. And so they're a little nervous to step into it because they don't want to step outside their scope. They want to be ethical. So if they don't have training on that, they're just like, I just would prefer to stay away from it. So if you want help finding some of those materials that, to explain how it's based in ABA, I'd be happy to share that with you.
Perfect. And then we did have a question that came through that was, what would you do if a client that has been diagnosed with ASD and depression, parentheses, is a teenager, and he does not want to say anything is important to him because he knows that this would mean he would be asked to put in some work. He is very unmotivated and demonstrates very little resilience and persistence.
Sure. So I'm actually really glad you asked that question because that's a common problem. A lot of times when we ask our clients, like, what do you value? They're like, I don't know, or they tell you nothing or whatever. That's where I really try to like tap into people's pain. So I bet that you've seen that client get angry about something, right? So you can use that and be like, hey, you were so angry at your mom the other day. That shows you really care about that. And I can help you with that. And like here's the path to get rid of that pain. Like if you don't want to experience how bad you felt that day, I can help you, so you you use their pain that you've maybe experienced or witnessed to help them realize what they truly value and care about.
I like that. It's similar to like Stephen Hayes and the two sides of the coin thing that he talks about.
Yeah, totally.
And then I have a question. Does Dr. Saint provide consultation? I have a client where both her psychologists have pretty much said they have given up and her family is going that way too. It seems like we are the only ones that are believing in this client right now.
Sad. I do. You can email me if you're interested in discussing that further. We could potentially set something up.
And then for all attendees, I'll also send out a resource list at the end of the presentation. So that email will also be on there. And then there's a question, sorry if this is a dumb question, but what constitutes as trauma? Does it have to be an event or can it be an accumulation of events that span over time, like a learning history? For example, how many aversive events does it take for it to be considered a trauma? Or is trauma only determined based on the current behavioral repertoire? And does it matter how many times they've experienced an aversive event?
Sure. Yeah, good question. I honestly think trauma is a term that's not operationally defined. People use it in many different ways. I guess I would be more interested in looking at, did a person experience something that was punishing to them? And the more powerfully punishing it is, the more it's going to create associations. Operant respondent conditioning is going to kick in. And so you mentioned in your question, could an accumulation of events cause trauma? Absolutely. So, I guess I would kind of think of trauma as just punishing events in general. And it could be on a spectrum of kind of punishing to extremely punishing. And either way, if it triggers a reflexive MO, and that escape behavior, then that means it's probably something we need to address and help them heal from. So.
True. Yeah, it's hard to operationally define.
Yeah, totally.
And then I have a few more questions. Are surrogate and reflexive MOs the same thing as transformation of stimulus function in app training?
Sure. So not necessarily, I guess surrogate could be. So transformation of function refers to when something basically changes function, right? When we pair it with something we value, it could go from being a punishing thing to a reinforcing thing. Like my example earlier, where I said, if I polish the car, my boss is going to be impressed with me or whatever. That was an example of transformation of function. So with a surrogate MO, that kind of happens too. I've seen that a lot where people are really defensive towards men, for example, because they were in an abusive relationship. So now all men they're kind of against, so that kind of transformed the function of male interaction for them. So they're kind of similar, yes.
Awesome. And then can you share the research article for the playground fence study? That sounds very interesting.
Yeah, it's a fun one. I'll try to look it up. Let me write myself a note.
Perfect. And then if we'll get that, then we will send it out in the resource list as well. It's a good question. And then, and then someone says, can your next book be a parent training book? Joking, but also not joking.
That's awesome.
And then also, could the STAR assessment be filled out with a client? It sounds like they're looking for something like this that might help one of their families take some perspective on their skill levels.
Yes, I love that. So that's actually something we commonly do, where the therapist will fill it out, maybe even the therapist and the parent will fill it out, and then we'll have the client fill it out, and then we'll compare, and we'll kind of use that as like a self-reflection activity to kind of help them see like where they gauge themselves, what areas they think they need to work on. And this actually helps with buy-in and increases that mindfulness and awareness of their skill levels. So that's really handy.
Yeah, and also STAR assessment will be sent out in follow-up email if you have not gotten it. And then we got another attendee saying, I am a BCBA and would like to know how I can begin to coordinate ACT therapy into my profession. What further education might I need?
Oh, that's awesome. I'm really excited to hear you want to use it. So there's a ton of really good ACT trainings that you can go to. I think Steve Hayes even still puts on some, which is really cool because he created ACTs. And so if you can learn from him, while he's still working, that's super awesome. But if you do go to one of these trainings and then consult with somebody who is really familiar with ACT for a little bit, even if it's just like monthly supervision or something like that. I think that would be adequate to for enough supervision to use it.
And then Leah just said, I just wanted to say, as a school-based BCABA who also struggles with ADHD, inattentive, and generalized anxiety, I am so interested in using ABA to treat mental health. However, I often find that the people I work with have the mentality of emotions are irrelevant when treating behaviors.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, unfortunately, we do see that a decent amount. There's radical behaviorists that accept emotions and internal events, and then there's methodological behavior analysts who don't. And so, you might run into that a little bit. I'm hoping our field is growing in our ability to measure internal events. And I think as we get better at measuring them, I think it's going to make more people comfortable with working with them. So
All right, so that was the last question that we did have. If anyone else has anything, you got like 15 seconds, you can come off mute as well, let us know. But otherwise, I am sending out the sign out link if you guys want to just sign out if you want to be eligible for CEUs. Oh, I got one. So it's a direct one. It says, how does the STAR assessment compare to the AFLs?
it's similar, but it focuses more on overall health. So it has 5 categories: daily living skills, leisure skills, but then it has emotional, social, and what am I missing? Did I list 5? So it is similar, but the goal of STAR assessment is that once a person masters about 80% of that, they're going to be able to live independently, have meaningful relationships. They're going to be able to have a happy life that also addresses their mental health too. AFLs is more of a skill acquisition assessment where it just kind of focuses on those functional skills. So this kind of incorporates more of that mental health piece as well, but from a ABA perspective. So
Okay, and then someone is saying, do you know if insurance accepts the STAR assessment?
So we're working on getting more and more insurances to approve it. So right now we've been including it in our insurance submissions and have not been getting kickback on it. We're doing research on the STAR assessment to help get more of that approval and acceptance from insurance companies on it. So at this point, some do and some don't.
Okay, well, we will be waiting when that time comes. All right, so no other questions came through. So speak now or forever hold your peace. I'll send out the sign out link one more time, and all resources that were talked about and accumulated during this presentation will be sent out. Otherwise, if you do have extra questions for Dr. Saint, please email her at katieJsaint@gmail.com. Yeah, and that's it. Thank you so much, Dr. Saint. Thank you for being here and just sharing your wisdom with us. Yeah, everybody's saying thank you, and I just think everyone's really grateful.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, everyone. It was a joy to be here.
All right, then we'll let everyone go and get on with your beautiful weekends. I hope everyone has a wonderful one. Take care, everyone.